Hello there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today we're digging into my all-time favorite James Bond film, You Only Live Twice. I don't think You Only Live Twice is many people's favorite Bond film. In fact, it seems to have a reputation as being a bit of an oddball in the series as a whole, but it is my favorite of the cinematic adventures. I'm not going to go as far as to say it's the best, but it is my favorite. It is nearest and dearest to my heart. It was, incidentally, the first Bond film I ever saw. It was the film my father showed me when he wanted to introduce me to the series. And it set a sort of template for what I look for in cinematic escapism on the whole. We'll talk exactly about why that is, because I think You Only Live Twice is such a wonderfully enigmatic and dreamlike and strange Bond film in a way that no Bond film was like it before, and no Bond film has been like it since. It's certainly a peculiar outlier in the series, but I think it's truly special in the extent of its commitment to aesthetic beauty, both on, visual terms. It has the luscious cinematography of the series, in my opinion, some of the most striking set design ever in the history of cinema, and one of John Barry's luscious scores. It's a feast for the eyes, a feast for the senses, completely untethered from reality. And I find that pretty special. Now, of course, You Only Live Twice was originally intended to be Sean Connery's farewell to the role of James Bond. Over the course of his tenure with Bond, he had been subject to a pretty grueling schedule, and the level of celebrity that came with the role somewhat wore him down, to the point where he asked to be released from the role earlier than intended. So You Only Live Twice was constructed as something of his farewell film. It's also not just his farewell film, but an attempt to keep up with the momentum of the series thus far. The series had begun as relatively subdued pulp thrillers in the scheme of what the series would become, and had turned into the first true blockbuster mass media franchise. James Bond in the 1960s was the Star Wars of its day. Star Wars is broadly credited with creating the multimedia phenomenon of franchising toys and licensed tie-ins and becoming this cultural behemoth. But really, James Bond established that playbook first with what happens with these mega successful films, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice. And You Only Live Twice did not occur in a vacuum. The broader phenomenon of what is called spy mania, which had really been bubbling since the late 50s and peaks in that sort of Thunderball time period, now starts to tilt over on the cultural stage into the more psychedelic textures of the late 1960s. Certainly you see that happen with things like the great television show The Prisoner, which was a quasi follow-up to the show Danger Man, also known as Secret Agent Man, and is just a full-on tilt into psychedelic surrealism in a way that is fairly bold and ahead of its time in a lot of ways. That series was really radical for a 1960s television show. And you see, at the same time, the Bond series is kind of departing. And You Only Live Twice signals that from the very start. One of the things I love most about You Only Live Twice is it really feels like a cinematic dream. From the minute it opens, it feels like you have just entered into a dream, and the way it closes, even on the final images of the credits, it's like that dream is concluding and you're waking up. This is a film that completely exists in that sort of strange dream logic space. And as if to signal that to the audience, the gun barrel occurs and opens on this frame of space. We have left the domain of the world behind. And this opening sequence for You Only Live Twice is, I think, very haunting. You Only Live Twice has this legacy that is sort of peculiar in the sense that it is so iconic that it has been one of the most parodied Bond films, certainly. If you grew up with the Austin Powers films and then watched You Only Live Twice after the fact, it's kind of a continual experience of recognition. Oh, this is where that came from. But this is a film of rich, striking images. These images embed your bed deep into not just your brain, but the brain of the cultural consciousness at large. These are some of the all-time striking images in cinema history. And this opening sequence is, in my opinion, one of the more uncanny representations of space travel. As brief as it is, there's something so peculiar about this sort of retro spaceship design that it's going with, this sort of predatory, devouring spaceship rocket that Spectre is using to capture this capsule in space. The tension that occurs as this astronaut is outside of the capsule and his cord is cut and he just drifts off into space as a kind of foreshadowing of what you would get in 2001: A Space Odyssey. That sort of isolation of space, all accentuated by this pulsing, driving John Barry march, his space march, Capsule in Space, that just recurs throughout the film whenever these capsule sequences occur. There are really three of them throughout the movie, kind of anchoring the way the story unfolds here. Right from the start, it's just this really uneasy tone, because as especially watching this as a child, the sequence is kind of creepy. That just that astronaut just being orphaned in space, this capsule being absorbed, and then we get a sequence that's even more peculiar to follow it up. Bond is on the case, and Bond is scarcely introduced before he is killed. This movie is one of those movies that really can be read as this sort of like death dream sort of story where there's a lot of bad film criticism that occurs where like a movie comes out and it's like, well, what if this character had really just died in the opening scene and the rest of the movie is just their fantasy as they are dying. It's kind of like a school of really bad film criticism. But the kind of template of this movie kind of follows that structure a little bit. Bond effectively, dies at the beginning of this movie, and the rest of the movie unfolds in a way that some film critics have really described as a sort of fairy tale logic. If you're familiar with the behind-the-scenes writing of You Only Live Twice, the novel itself is very peculiar and strange in and of itself. It is my favorite Ian Fleming novel, as well as my favorite Bond film. So there's kind of a kinship here. And both the novel and the film have this pretty significant dreamlike fluidity about them. The novel, You Only Live Twice in particular, goes into some very nightmarish places. It's almost like you're trapped in a peculiar nightmare, especially during the sequences in the novel around the Garden of Death, which loosely feeds into the movie in some ways with the volcano lair and the piranha pool and things like that. But the novel is significantly more intense and steeped in this sort of existential weight. And the way the story gets sort of translated into something almost entirely new, but in a parallel direction by Roald Dahl, who is famous for his very fanciful children's novels, is kind of a fable-like story in which I've heard it described as Bond ends up fighting like the evil the evil gnome that lives in the mountain, kind of being this sort of mythical version of Blofeld, played with great uh, oddball menace by Donald Pleasance. I really like Donald Pleasance in this. He's not a physical threat, but he has this wonderful, like, sort of mythic madness about him. Donald Pleasance is a character who naturally has very um, uneasy tension about him, especially when he's playing sinister characters. It's why he's so great as Dr. Loomis in the original Halloween films, and is actually the great through line of that series is his portrayal of that character just sinking more and more into madness. He brings that sort of twitchy energy to Blofeld here as a foe, and you kind of get this sense of Bond kind of working his way through a kind of purgatory after his, symbolic death here. The characters will remark uh, jokingly throughout the story that this is Bond's second life, that Bond is a corpse. But there is a sense in which the story really is Bond really is kind of floating through territory he's not familiar with. One of the great things about You Only Live Twice is how committed it is to its setting. Um, the previous Bond films in the Connery run, many of them were very involved in travelogue as an aspect of the movies, but You Only Live Twice just feels like the story is really about Bond becoming a fish out of water in Japan in a way that is played with in previous stories, but now is really at the forefront. This is a film about a British character being kind of stripped of his familiar surroundings and kind of drifting into this new world to encounter his old enemy there. And Connery's performance, the most criticized aspect of this movie, I think, broadly among Bond fans, is that Connery is essentially uninvested, is a kind word to describe his performance in this movie. I think that's a very fair critique. I just don't think it hurts the movie very much. First off, a bored Sean Connery has more charisma than most actors on their best day. It's just true. Connery has natural screen presence even when he's not. And there's just a lot of roguish charm that naturally comes through in his portrayal here. But also there's a sense in which the story doesn't require Bond to be a particularly active figure. He's doing investigatory work throughout the story to push it forward, but it's not really a story about Bond as an active character. There's a sense in which I think of this movie as being in a parallel lane, a kind of like fantastical, more fun, colorful, outlandish parallel to something like the film that came out right around the same time, which was John Boorman's Point Blank, if you've never seen it, with Lee Marvin, which is essentially a story about a criminal who may or may not be dead, getting revenge on the people that set him up. And it kind of shifts into this place where Lee Marvin, who plays the lead character there, is almost like a ghost drifting from scene to scene, haunting everybody that he's come across. And there's a sense in which this is a film about thematically and structurally about Bond having, essentially being on his second life. So this sort of sleepwalking characterization of Bond almost thematically works in the way that I kind of pointed out with the film Spectre. Much less successfully, Bond is kind of introduced as a dead man walking there in the film Spectre, and Daniel Craig's more muted performance, whether intentional or not, sort of plays into that thematic aspect of it here. I think it kind of works with the rhythms of this movie that Bond is a little bit more withdrawn. That's not to say it wouldn't be a sharper movie if Connery wasn't a little bit more invested in some of the the witty repartee he's given here. He's actually given some very good zingers and dialogue here, but he is generally a little bit more restrained, a little bit more muted. Uh, but uh, it also just kind of with Connery's presence, it also just kind of comes off as like relaxed confidence. Bond just being very assured throughout this entire picture. And it's not that he doesn't have some good relationships in the movie. I really like how Connery interacts with Tiger Tanaka here as a counterpoint to M and an esteemed ally here, kind of performing the work of guide for Bond across Japan. And there's a whole host of really good side characters here. Henderson, played by Charles Gray, who will reappear in Diamonds Are Forever as a as a different character, as Blofeld, in fact, is so wonderfully charming here as the sort of local guide trying to get Bond to understand how different customs are in Japan and kind of give Bond some tidbits about how the story goes. But in many ways, this is not a character-driven film. This is if the previous four movies of the Sean Connery era are all trying to grapple with this idea of like how far are we taking intrigue, how far are we taking character, how are we playing with set pieces, and all doing that to a different degree. You Only Live Twice is the film that really just leaps straight into the set piece model of Bond. It is by Lewis Gilbert, who would give us The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, which are both effectively, in their own way, reproductions of the template that exists in You Only Live Twice. The only difference is that You Only Live Twice has a greater earnestness about it. Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker are essentially tongue-in-cheek, campy, self-parody affairs. You Only Live Twice is outrageous, but it's also somewhat earnest. It's not parody. It's just extremely fantastical and detached from a standard sense of a more grounded sense, I should say, of narrative logic. It drifts from set piece to set piece, but these images, one after the other, are just so great. This is a film that is photographed by Freddie Young, whose cinematography is just immaculate. From the one shot that always stays in my mind is the way the title sequence, which unfolds with some of the most striking images of any Bond title sequence, into this wonderful sunset image that then kind of crossfades into this view of the harbor before Bond is given his funeral at sea. You get this such great fantasy sequence where Bond's corpse is retrieved from the depths. And then he's, again, launched on his mission by being shot out of a torpedo tube, where he gets this scenic shot of him climbing onto the shore of Japan. It's just, and that's just like in the first few minutes of this movie, and it's just like one great image after another. Bond meets his primary, love interest of the story at a sumo match, and they're just kind of sitting there, having this awkward conversation as Bond, somewhat amusingly, is given the kind of recognition phrase of "I love you," which he has to repeat not just to Aki but to Tiger Tanaka later in the movie. That sort of awkward conversation unfolding alongside this great backdrop. It's this wonderful sort of travelogue moment that will occur again in something like The Man with the Golden Gun, but it's here. And every scene in this movie is kind of like that. I think this film has so many set pieces, some of them are so underrated. One example being the pretty marvelous fight in Osato's office, where Bond uses a couch as a weapon. I mean, that is just fantastic stunt work. I think it's one of the better fights in the series. It's very tense. It's very physical. Furniture is just getting flung left and right. That sort of wonderful set piece is just like kind of like one after the other in this movie, up until you get the grand climax with these gorgeous images of a ninja army swarming a volcano lair en masse. And it's the kind of thing where that sort of climax is so big and so potentially chaotic, but it's just full of beautiful images. Like the way they even just shoot that ninja army emerging in the crater and in the moonlight is just so striking and alluring and rich. And every single moment in this movie is accompanied by John Barry's sweeping score. I think there is no moment in the entire Bond series that makes my heart leap with such joy as the fight at Kobe Docks when Bond goes up to the roof being chased by Sato's, heavies, and it just does this glorious crane shot of Connery just running across the roof, taking out the other thugs, and Barry's score is just going wild with its rendition of the title song, which, if you've seen my video on the James Bond songs, you know that You Only Live Twice is my favorite of the theme songs. Like the film itself, it's so kind of simple but enigmatic and striking in a way that just kind of gets under the skin. It's no wonder that it gave us one of the best moments in Mad Men when they reused the You Only Live Twice theme. It just has such poetic grandeur, and this is a movie that is simultaneously really silly but like really strikingly poetic at the same time. Another great moment is the death of Aki, which is this wonderfully Fleming-esque bit of, uh, macabre, dark territory where she dies thanks to poison dripping down a string by an assassin. It's an offhanded moment, as is the case with these movies. At times, it's Bond kind of springs from that death, but it's a dark and kind of frightening moment in the midst of it. There's a lot of moments in these movies that just this movie in particular that has that sort of like, wow, that's just a really great, striking bit of cinema and cinematic language, not as storytelling per se, because I wouldn't say that You Only Live Twice is what we would think of as great narrative cinema, but it's great cinema in the terms of cinema as a space for the creation of image and sound and rhythm. It's, as I've said, it really is a true movie as a dream, from a kind of grounded narrative, but still just in this space of kind of the right blend of uncanny strangeness and with hints of menace and glamour along the way. Um, I think some of the weaker points in this movie are when certain characters are reprising tropes. I think Helga Brandt is entertaining to watch on screen, but is not quite the equal of Fiona Volpe. And Blofeld's henchman Hans is kind of like Red Grant 2.0, but that also kind of works with this sort of dreamlike, exaggerated Bond film fantasia, where in some ways it's almost calling back to the myth of Bond as it had kind of developed in the films up until that point. This was the bigger and bolder and more outrageous Bond films. So in some ways, calling back to these archetypes that had then been established, the sinister femme fatale working for Spectre, the kind of quasi-Aryan threatening stocky henchman, the execution of the hench person by savage means, which had been a recurring theme throughout all these movies. And in the previous film, Thunderball had just sharks. Here is done with a piranha pool. You kind of are getting this really, really interesting kind of Alice in Wonderlandy take on what the Bond formula looks like in You Only Live Twice, which makes it an interesting movie that for Connery's last, had it really been that way. Um, and certainly, this is the movie that is paying off a multi-film arc where Bond is coming face to face with Spectre. It really is peculiar to see it leap into such kind of grand ambitions, even after the last movie. Thunderball's plot, for as outrageous as that movie gets, is still grounded in a fundamental reality. At this point, the movie You Only Live Twice announces from the very start that this sort of plot is firmly in the realm of surrealist science fiction. But it does carry forward a lot of the aspects of Spectre that we have seen thus far. This sense that Spectre is operating as like a shadow corporation is an idea that is very visually represented in Thunderball. They have kind of a steel, inhuman corporate meeting room. Here, Spectre is very closely partnered with a corporate partner, Osato, and a lot of the investigation around this is very industrial. It's very much about what chemicals are being shipped, and Bond infiltrating this sort of like corporate building, which we hadn't really seen that sort of level of Bond in the full-on like international business world of things in these movies thus far. Certainly, he's posing as businessmen in prior movies, but this is kind of Bond interfering with like global economics and politics in a way that speaks to the scale of what Spectre is doing and how Spectre is really at the center of politics, operating as an entirely greedy, merciless parasite on the world, just out to make money, just disrupting the entire stability of the world in the interest of making a few more bucks. That's what's really sinister about Spectre in a lot of these movies, is that it's just an opportunistic parasite on the world. And here it's literalized in the imagery that we really get. Blofeld is a quasi. I've described him as like kind of like an evil mountain gnome, but he's really also kind of a satanic figure here in his dark underground lair, so gorgeously designed by Ken Adam, part futuristic lair, part medieval castle. It's an incredible fusion of fantasy and reality there that speaks to the utmost brilliance of Ken Adam as a talent. I understand why this film may not work for folks as well as some of its predecessors. Objectively speaking, I think you might make a strong case for From Russia with Love being a stronger film. But in terms of just a Bond film delivering a purely unabashed, like full-on spectacle, the likes of which is just very distinct and not really reproduced since, You Only Live Twice just stands out as such a marvelously singular film experience. Both inside the Bond canon, no Bond film feels as quite profoundly dreamlike as You Only Live Twice in its sort of like quasi-earnest way. And no other film of its era puts this sort of fantasia on such a grand canvas. That it won me over as a child, and it still wins me over when I watched it to prepare for this video. I was just caught up in it all over again. So I look forward to hearing what you all think of You Only Live Twice. I wonder if any of you resonate here with what I've had to say about it. Obviously, there's plenty more to say about it. I didn't even touch on the fun and delight of Little Nelly, which I think is just such a marvelously charming set piece and a great way to take Bond gadgets to the next level. I mean, Little Nelly is in many ways the first like full on set piece that is just all about a vehicle doing gadgets. They kind of played a version of it in Goldfinger, and here they just kind of go full broke. And I'm really shocked at how well a sequence from the late 60s still holds up as entertaining spectacle today. It just works so well. I've not even touched on the unfortunately very dated and dubious aspect of Bond adopting uh, a, a Japanese disguise. That was an element, that it's kind of pulling from the source material to an extent, but it is an aspect that is a little bit rough coming back to that movie now. And there's plenty more to be said about, in general, this film's peculiar aspect to how Western and Japanese cultures uh, interact with one another, enough to probably make a whole other video just discussing those themes. But I'm still going to commit to my intention to always leave these videos around 30 minutes. So I'm going to leave things here. Let me know what you think if you only look twice in the comments. I'll look forward to engaging with you all there, and I'll catch you in the next one.